Okay, thank you. And last time I was suggesting some principles to keep in mind as we engage in conversation with folk whose political, ideological, cultural, spiritual perspectives are different from our own. And I was stressing to enter such a conversation with humility and hope. Humility, meaning that we should enter conversations saying to ourselves that we don't know everything and we could well be wrong about something, and that our conversation partner, even if we don't like their basic perspective, might have something to say from which we could learn, might have something of value to add to our own perspectives. That's the humility part. And the hope part is, even though such conversations are difficult and maybe even sometimes seem to be impossible, to hope that with God's grace, sometimes in contentious conversations, something fruitful might emerge. So humility and hope. Today, we're going to look a little more closely at some of the emotional and spiritual aspects of polarization, of interactions with people with whom we profoundly disagree. And I'm going to talk a little bit about strategies and attitudes that we could cultivate in ourselves. We can't control the other person, but we can have an influence on ourselves and our own attitudes and behavior. And that's the most we can hope for, that we ourselves could turn the temperature down a little. So what I'd like to talk about are the roots of some of the polarization and dichotomistic thinking that we see around us. Before we get going, I've got to admit up front that one of the culprits in promoting polarized attitudes is Christianity itself. Christianity has been an enormous advocate for reconciliation and compassion, but it also, throughout its history, has fostered polarization. It goes way back to the Gospel of John, where there's a lot of language of children of light versus children of darkness, that there are good guys and bad guys. There are people chosen by God, but others who are servants of Satan. And those passages throughout the history of Christianity have been seized upon to say that we know who the children of God are, who the children of light are, and it's us. And we also know who the children of darkness, who the minions of Satan are, and it's them. It's those people we don't like. So throughout the history of Christianity, groups have been singled out as basically demonic, beyond the pale, not candidates for redemption. And probably the most notorious from the Middle Ages on have been Jews, who were in the Middle Ages called Christ killers. It was assumed that they had had their chance in the first century to follow Christ and had rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and therefore there was no hope for them. And therefore they were candidates for pogroms, persecutions, and eventually genocide. For Protestants, the villain also often became Catholics. The Pope was called the devil's minion. The Roman Catholic Church was called the synagogue of Satan. And from the Reformation period on through the 18th century, there were multiple wars between Protestants and Catholics, and very little effort, although there were some sporadic, for reconciliation or mutual understanding or even peaceful coexistence. So Christianity itself has often fostered an us versus them, take no prisoners attitude, and that's unfortunate. But on the other hand, it also has been in the forefront of trying to build bridges and open doors and foster conversations amongst various groups. So the history of Christianity is mixed. A lot of bad stuff, but also a lot of good stuff. And one of the things I want to focus on today is a strategy that often appeared in Christianity, which, in the face of polarization, to try to identify what's the root emotional problem. Because people adopt political positions, religious positions, cultural positions for deep-seated emotional reasons. We are not purely rational animals. Usually there's something below the surface that's motivating the intensity of our political and cultural commitments. And unless we can get at what that is and deal with it, nothing good's going to happen. And in much of the history of Christianity, the main motive in contentious situations of what makes them so heated, what makes them so intense, what makes them so adversarial, of course, the culprit has been identified as human sinfulness in general. And then behind that, the question becomes, so what is the root of sin that manifests itself in these hurtful and unfortunate interactions between adversarial cultural and political positions? And often, particularly with Martin Luther, and to some extent John Calvin himself, the candidate for what's the root emotion that's disturbing everybody, that's fueling this animosity, is fear. That the root of all evil isn't necessarily greed or money, but rather it's fear. So if you're in an argumentative situation and things are getting tense, it might be time to draw back and ask yourself, why am I reacting so strongly? What am I afraid of? And also try to figure out, what's the other person with whom I'm having the argument? What's that person afraid of? And if you can do that and talk about the basic fears, then there might be some hope for at least mutual understanding. Because most of us can understand fear. If somebody can say, well, I'm afraid of this, usually there's something in our own life that we can relate to. And that can be the basis for at least some empathy, some compassion. So even in regard to the insurrectionists on January 6th, about whom I've been doing a lot of reading and looking at the interviews that some of them have done. And it's important for me to ask myself, what was the fear that was motivating their extreme actions? What was it they were afraid of? And often you don't have to read very far between the lines to figure it out. So what I'd like to do today, and this is maybe a little risky, and I must say, I'm entering this conversation saying to myself, I could be wrong about a whole lot of things in regard to this. But I'd like to talk about, what is it that you could say the extreme right and the extreme left are afraid of. I want to, Jack pointed out that, there's a problem of identifying positions with the extremes. But and that's absolutely right. But sometimes what people are afraid of, all of us are afraid of, is most evident in its extreme manifestations. That was a basic principle of psychotherapy for Sigmund Freud. If you want to understand human problems, look at them where they are writ large in extreme psychological dysfunctions and realize those same dynamics are going on in the rest of us, only not as intensely and not as extremely. So I'd like to start off with just the question, and I'm going to invite conversation to see if you find any of this plausible or have another theory, is what is the cultural and political and religious right afraid of? And then I'm going to do the same with the left. And by right, I'm not talking about traditional Republicans, folk who want a balanced budget, folk who want economic policies that promote the growth of business. I'm not talking about those folk. I'm talking about the more fiery cultural conservatives. What is it that they're afraid of? And in looking at the interviews with the people who have been in Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, QAnon, any of the militia groups, and even some folk that I know in my family. Um, it's a couple of things. The big one is they're afraid that a way of life that they have known, that has informed their ancestors for generations, that they're comfortable with, that they understand, in which they feel valued, that that way of life is being jeopardized. And more particularly, a fear that emerges is the fear that the culture that valued and recognized the worth and dignity of physical labor, mechanical intelligence, um, in industrial skill, farming, mining, um, all of which required uh, a kind of physical intelligence, the ability to know how to fix a drill press, the ability to know what kind of, almost instinctively, in what pattern to put down the fertilizer. That those kinds of almost manual labor skills, which society used to value, which they had seen valued in the lives of their grandfathers, grandmothers, parents, even, that society was no longer attaching any sense of worth to that. And that those kinds of jobs were disappearing. And that instead, society, the general culture, was praising and even lionizing technological skill, the ability to work online with data, the ability to have finely honed technical skills, which required a lot of training and a lot of cognitive ability, and entrepreneurship. And as a result, the farmers, the miners, the machinists, the plumbers were being disparaged. And the folk who were being valued and valorized tended to be college graduates, may even folk with master's degrees, folk who were in technological, health services, education, the law, medicine in general, um, the upper echelons of business, that those were the folk who were being valued. And that hurt. I had one friend who said to me, to be a working class white guy is terrible in the United States. Said, my kind of people have nothing to be proud of anymore. Said, other ethnicities are dominating sports, basketball. You can still find white guys in as quarterbacks and coaches. But he said, basically, all we've got is NASCAR and country music. And most of the country hates that. I think it's significant that one of these groups called themselves the Proud Boys. And one of their founders who left the group said that was very deliberate. He said, because these are people who have nothing to be proud of otherwise. All they've got is the memory of a time in which their ethnicity, their skills, their manual labor had been valued, and now they feel that's slipping away. So afraid that a way of life that was familiar, comfortable, in which one thought you could succeed and be valued, that way of life was vanishing. That's a pretty big fear. Another fear is that way of life is attached to a place, a village, a home, a geographic locale where your ancestors have lived, where your ancestors are buried in the church cemetery, and that those locales are threatened, that small towns, villages are in economic trouble in many parts of the country. Think of Western Pennsylvania or Northeastern Pennsylvania, or even parts of central Pennsylvania. Think of a town where it was often the towns were settled in the 18th century. Everybody's ancestors lived there for generations. And now those towns have no businesses, very little work, and people have to move out. And they don't like that. I know folk in West Virginia in towns where young people could move, and sometimes they are forced to for economic necessity, but they really hate it. They would prefer to stay there. So there's a fear that the stability of having a place where your ancestors have lived, a place that's actually homogenous, where your kind of people have been there for generations. Think of Lidditz with Moravians all over the place. And in the area around Hershey, it used to be mostly Scots-Irish Presbyterians. But as the economy changes and technology and technological skill becomes more important, and those technological skills are often very specific, you have to go where the jobs are, which means society has become very mobile. In fact, the last statistic I saw was that the average American moves 6 times, and not just like down the block or to a neighboring town, but to 6 significantly different geographic locales in their lifetime. That's a lot of mobility. And for folk who don't want that, who are loyal and attached to their village, that's a threat. That's scary. And usually when people are scared, it manifests itself as anger. Fear breeds anger. I see that all the time in my dogs. And I have 3 dogs. The biggest one is 12 pounds. Walking down the street, they see a big dog also being walked. Their response is initially for there's 3 seconds of fear, but then that's converted into ferocity. And I keep thinking, are my dogs really cognitively challenged? They're 12 pounds, but they start to go to attack the big dog. And they don't have a prayer in hell of ever doing any damage to the big dog. But that's the way people are too. That fear manifests itself as anger, finding a scapegoat, finding somebody who you think is the cause of your problem and attacking them. So globalization is a big threat to folk who have a deep sense of place, of rootedness in a town. And that spills over into just a set of cultural values, where if you live in a particular region, you like the region's food, you like the way people dress, you like the music, you like the way they talk. And when folk move in or seem to be moving in, who talk differently, dress differently, have different music, have different food, that's felt as a threat. And that's scary. And that makes people angry. I heard someone the other day say, he was an older person, he was saying that when he was growing up, there was still a lot of German restaurants in Lancaster County in which the ethnic heritage is still largely German. But then he said, today you can't find a single one. If you want to eat sauerbraten, it's not there. If you want to eat kielbasa, maybe there's a couple of restaurants that will have it. And a few grocery stores will have it. But bratwurst, no. And he said, instead, what you're seeing popping up all over is Mexican restaurants. And I've heard other folk talk about the disappearance of Pennsylvania Dutch food, that it's hard to get chicken with waffles, which I'm from New Jersey. So I always thought that was an abomination. But I realized that folk who grew up with it really love it. Or slippery noodles, chicken pot pie, which actually has no crust on it. So I never understood why it was called pie. But anyway, folk get scared when that stuff that has then part of their identities starts to disappear. So multiculturalism is felt as a threat, as something scary to folk who have been nurtured and comforted by even certain kinds of food. Just thinking of comfort food. Um, what if meatloaf disappeared and was replaced entirely by tacos? That's the way some people see multiculturalism, as a blow to the things they're familiar with that have given them comfort. And the last thing is, and it's important, is fear of economic decline. That it looks to many folk like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, or the middle class is entering the ranks of the lower middle class, and that many folk, particularly those who had been in family farms, had worked in mining and factories, that they're downwardly mobile. And it's due to technological changes that they can't understand and don't seem to be able to stop, and they're scared and they're mad. It was pointed out that Hillary Clinton in 2016 really hurt herself in West Virginia when she said that she was going to that the coal industry would be eliminated, but that educational efforts would retrain people for, as she said, in order to enter this new economy. A lot of the folk in West Virginia who were interviewed after that said, we like what we do. We don't want to enter a technological economy. I don't want to go to community college and learn how to be a programmer. I like working in the mines. That's what my ancestors have done. So please don't tell us that we can be retrained. And then a few of them actually confessed that they weren't sure that they could be retrained, that they had the kind of cognitive skills that lent themselves to that. So fear of economic decline is part of the fear that feeds the anger on the right end of the spectrum. But to give equal time, it's not as if the left is not afraid and that its fears are not fueling anger. It's just that the fears are different. And in fact, the fears are almost the exact opposite. One big one is that many folk in the left do benefit personally, culturally, financially from globalization. Just a minute ago, we were talking about, I teach in a lot of different places in Europe. And I have friends in those places. And I visit them and I email them. And we work collaboratively on books and articles. It turns out that there are these services that calculate how many times has somebody clicked on one of your articles online. And it turns out that mine are read most intensively in Slovakia. So globalization is my friend. I like it. It helps me make a living and it supports my social life. And that's the way it is with a lot of folk in education, research, medicine, international law, business. Globalization works and it's attractive. So the fear that certain economic policies or certain kinds of retrenchment, certain kind of isolationism might become the wave of the future, that's scary. And that's makes folk who like globalization and have benefited from it, that makes them very scared and therefore very angry that anybody who's trying to take that away or turn the tide back. And then there's also, I think on the left, a fear of the very thing that the people on the right like, and that's homogenization. Often folk on the right like the vision of a village where everybody has the same values, everybody believes the same kind of thing, and everybody dresses more or less alike and likes the same kind of music. They like that. But for folk on the left, that looks like a vision of hell. um, because often folk on the left have either been in college or moved and worked with, or even been in the military with folk of very different cultures and liked it, felt enriched by it, and want to see that keep going. And often folk on the left don't like homogenization because they themselves have folk in their families or friends who are different in some regard from the average European descended American. We all have, on the left, a lot of people have friends of different races, friends of different ethnicities, friends of different gender preferences, and we have them in our families. And we don't want to see a backlash against that. So on the left, there's a fear that there might be an homogenization on the horizon. And that is a threat to one's way of life. And that's scary. And I think, and this might not be as important, but there's also a fear of a wave of, I'm going to call it, for want of a better word, anti-elitism. A lot of the rhetoric on the right is targeted towards elites. It's not clear who the elites are, but there are suspicions. And it certainly includes lawyers, doctors, researchers, the Center for Disease Control, professors, teachers, people in the social services. These folk are highly educated, college graduates, and society rewards them. And the people on the right are afraid of that. And the people on the left know that, and therefore react negatively to the people on the right and think of them as anti-intellectual, anti-elite, anti-professional, and maybe even stupid. In fact, I had one friend who said, what January 6th really was a revolt of the stupids, the revenge of the stupids against a society that they think has forgotten them and left them behind. I've run into that in airports, actually, and my reaction to it was fear and anger. I remember vividly one time I was coming back from Europe and going through customs, and the American customs guy looked at me. Now, I did have on a rumpled tweed jacket with patches on the sleeves and a pipe sticking out of my pocket and a pile of books in my hand. So the guy just looked at me and said, "You're a professor, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And then he proceeded to abuse me. He said, because I said, "How'd you know I was a professor?" And he said, "Well, it was the way you're dressed, except that your clothes aren't wrinkled enough and you don't have ketchup stains on your shirt, and the money isn't falling out of your pocket." And he kept going on and on with a stereotype of a dysfunctional academic. And he was doing it not in a friendly way, but with real disdain and contempt in his eyes. And so I felt myself getting angry. And I realized my anger was born of fear. What if this attitude is widespread? Then I'm in trouble. So there is, and I have a lot of physician friends, and I bet there are some physicians here who really were alarmed at the disparagement of medical research, and folk who said, "I don't care about the science. I don't believe in science. I don't believe the medical professionals. They're all liars." That's scary, and that triggers a self-defensive response of anger. So there's anger on the left, anger on the right. There's even a little anger in the middle, but it's a little more nuanced. It's anger at the fact that everybody's getting so mad at everybody else, which is scary. If you value reconciliation and stability and a modicum of tranquility, than to live in a situation where there are insults flying, and even now, fists and weapons flying. That's disturbing. That's scary, and that triggers anger. Um, I have a Mennonite friend, a minister, who said, remember, Mennonites are pacifists, and he said, I don't understand why Democrats and Republicans are so mad at each other. And then he said, it really gets to me. I'd really like to punch both of them. So, so there you have even a kind of weird anger popping up in the folk who want reconciliation and are scared that it's not happening, and that transforms itself into anger. Now, my conclusion to all this is all these fears are legitimate and understandable. And if we could get in a conversation at the level of what's the primal fear, what's the basic fear that's motivating the tension here, that's motivating the antipathy, we could probably develop some empathy for our adversaries. Some of these fears I don't share myself, but I understand them. And I can imagine what it would be like to feel them. And if I can do that, then usually my anger level goes down. And I begin to feel sorry for my adversaries and say, yeah, you're human. You've got fears, I've got fears, all God's children got fears, and sometimes we don't deal with them very well. Sometimes we don't deal with them in productive ways. And I can understand why you're so mad. I can understand why you're even mad at me. So to try to get at what's the fear behind the animosity, behind the confrontation, might, at least in ourselves, reduce the tension and maybe even foster some compassion and empathy for the folk who seem to be our foes. So I think that's a start in developing an attitude of mutuality and understanding and even compassion in the midst of contentious situations. Just always say to yourself, the person I'm arguing with is a human being. Human beings are frail. Presbyterians believe they're also very sinful, and frail, sinful human beings are subject to fears, and often those fears manifest themselves in weird and destructive ways. They've got their fears, I've got my fears, all God's children got fears. And at least that gives us something in common, a basis maybe for mutual understanding. That might not seem very hopeful or to be the basis for much hope. And I hope in the next 2 weeks, I'll have even stronger reasons for hope, based more on God's grace and the power of God's reconciling love. But I think a first step is to recognize we're all in this together. Life is scary. Our contemporary world is scary. We're all scared, and that gives us something in common. It gives us something to relate to. Our fears might be somewhat different, and the way we deal with them and the solutions we envision may be different, but we're all afraid, and we all need God's comfort. So what I'd like to do now is just throw the conversation open to hopefully not violent reactions, but questions, observations, supplements.
Could you discuss the role of social media in fueling these fears?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That's the problem. Social media feeds on fear. Advertising feeds on fear. Every product tries to identify something you're afraid of, play up that fear, exacerbate it, and then promise you the solution. That if you just buy this product, that thing you are so afraid of will not happen to you. I think one of the obvious examples was a room deodorizer advertisement that stressed the fact that some people have rooms or clothes that are so smelly that they don't even know it because they've gotten accustomed to it. They called that being nose blind. And in the scenarios they showed, folk were going into somebody's room and just being appalled at the stench, but the person whose room it was didn't even know that there was anything unusual about the aroma, um, and and then it played up, and therefore this person will be ostracized and have no friends. Nobody will ever visit him unless you buy this product, this room deodorizer, and then you will no longer be nose blind. Your room will no longer stink to high heaven, and you will have a stellar, extravagant social life. So it was playing on fear of being disliked, fear of being ostracized, fear of being condemned, um, in order to sell a product. Advertising does that consistently. But so do all forms of social media, even the news. Um, frantically looking for the stories that will frighten people, so that they'll say, "Well, I got to watch the news to see how this works out because this is scary." Um, very rarely are there news stories just about people being happy. Um, in Lancaster, our local news station tries to always end on a positive note after they've had 25 minutes of horror. Uh, and last week, they I think they were searching to find something happy to cover. So they covered the story of a motorist who stopped and picked up a lame duck on the road and took it to a vet. That was the best they could do for a happy story. So yeah, all the social media play up our fears of imminent disaster to our culture, to our nation, to our families, to ourselves. If something terrible is going to happen, in order to get viewers. So social media is a serious problem. They usually find a niche, like a particular kind of fear to probe and nudge and exacerbate, to get the audience that's susceptible to that kind of fear.
Just a comment. One attribute of fear is things you don't understand. And to me, that makes it very important to be a listener.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's entirely right, especially to everybody. Things are changing culturally and socially, politically, economically at a very fast rate in ways that we can't understand. I don't even think the economists understand. Um, and when that happens, when you don't really know what's going on or why it's happening to you, it's easy to want a quick fix and to say, well, what we really need is a dramatic political action to fix everything. Or we really need a strong leader who's messianic and will have all the answers and make our lives better, because we know we can't make our lives better because we don't understand what's going on. So yeah, so the sense of I don't really understand what's happening in the world and in my culture and in my town, in my nation. I don't even understand what's going on in my family. That invites polarization and extreme views of what could be the fix.
This is David. I was visiting on mute with my wife, and when you began, what is the left afraid of? At first, I said, that's going to be a short list. The privileged, but my wife Pam didn't mention. I'll share. How about climate change? Is that
Oh yeah,
fear? And that was not on your list.
Yeah, no, that is, and that's a big one. That's a sweeping one because that's fear of extinction, a fear of the destruction, not of our village or our way of life, but of the whole planet. So that's a huge one. And it's a fear that it's a bit abstract. And there is some data to correlate with this, that it's a fear that's more common amongst college educated people. I think because if you're a concrete thinker, you don't really see it on a day-to-day basis, unless maybe you live in the Arctic and see the glaciers melt. So it's easy to disbelieve it. So you have to do some reading and be able to think abstractly in order to fear or to realize climate change is real and it's scary. Yeah, but thank you for adding climate change.
Yeah, I had one more. This last summer, there was a period where fear of the police state seemed to be a big trigger.
Yeah. Yeah, and that cuts on both sides. That's a more sweeping fear on both the left and the right. There is a tendency for the right to be more afraid of big government and the left to be more afraid of big business. And in both, there's a fear that the cards are stacked against you, either because on the right, the government's taxing you to death and is going to reallocate the money to people who are different from you, to a different race, different ethnicity, different economic class. And on the left, there's a fear that an unregulated economy is a rigged game and will make the rich richer and the poor poorer. But in both cases, there's the fear of something big, either big government and the police state, or big business.
Charlie, you have a question?
Yeah, I think I'd put it at, maybe it's a statement, we can go from there. I think really fears come from a lack of a sense of control.
Mm-hmm.
And control is it gets tied up with power. Yeah, that's true. But it's the expectation of knowing what's going to happen next. We know how our lives work, be it in labor or be it intellectual. We know what the rules are to our existence. When that falls apart, that's when we start resorting to fear and trying to protect the structure that we've always known.
Yeah.
And it's less about defending anything other than, I need a structure I understand. I don't care what that structure is, but if it's constantly changing, it's a problem. Now, I was in the tech industry, and early on, they did a lot of studies about stress working on computers. And they did so by measuring perspiration on people's palms. You set them down in a new software that they've never seen, which has its own set of rules, the people were falling apart.
Yeah.
Now, as they became comfortable with it, regardless of what it was, that stress went away. And what I see in society is, as one group tries to get advantage over the other, the rules are changing, and we're all resorting to this thing that says, stop it, I want it to be my way.
Right. And I think that fear is on all positions on the ideological and cultural spectrum. That on one hand, some folks are saying that the minds are closing. I don't understand why. I can't control it. I can't stop it. I don't know what to do about it. I don't know how to adapt to a new situation. And also in my profession, colleges are closing and everything's getting downsized. There's less money for higher education, fewer applicants. And one of the most vulnerable positions to go are philosophy and religious studies, and the humanities in general. And so all my friends are saying, we don't quite know why this is happening, and we certainly don't know what to do about it, but it's very destabilizing and it's very scary. We don't know how to adjust to a new environment.
One of the, oh, I'm sorry. One of the other issues that I think of is fear of diversity, and looking at this group and attacking what is racism and where are we in all of this. It's a huge issue as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I think it is. And I think that's fear of otherness in general, where you grow up in a small town, let's say in central Pennsylvania, and everybody's Anglo or German and all like the same food and all look the same, might even have the same genetic code. And then a group moves in, a couple of families from a different ethnicity and a different cultural background. And that's perceived as a threat. What if there get to be too many of them? And what if we have to adapt our way of life to theirs? That's happening in Lancaster City a lot, in regard to the continuing influx of Hispanic people. What if we all have to eat tacos all the time? So it's a fear of otherness coupled with economic fear. What if they work for lower wages and take our jobs? And it's a convenient way of scapegoating. Like, my way of life is changing. I feel it's being endangered by multiculturalism. I fear that I'm not going to be paid as much as my parents were. And I want to blame it on somebody. So I'm going to blame it on the immigrants.
It's supposed to be a raised hand.
Kenny's, do you have another comment?
Go ahead.
Hello.
Yes.
One of the things that I'm interested in as relates to change is to go to graduations of Hershey High School in the 60s and go to Hershey High School graduation in the 2020s and listen to the names that are read off of each of the graduates. In the 60s, they were either German or Italian. If you listen to the names that are read off 2020, it's unbelievable the multicultural differences between those generations. And you see those changes, and you see the catalyst probably is a medical center. When we moved to Hershey, there were no Democrats. Now there's a strong Democratic Party. That's one significant change. So as we live through these, and the basic community of Hershey, Dairy Township in the 60s was white Republican. That clearly is not the case. And that change has come across generationally because of the introduction of dramatic amount of difference.
Yeah. And that raises the question of how much change and how much pluralism can a society take? I have a friend who's a recently retired general who said he had to retire because the rate at which the military was changing, and he approved of the changes, he liked them. He thought there were changes for the better. But he said the rate that the military is changing is making everybody nervous and kind of weird. And he said it was even making him tense. So he figured it was time to get out and let somebody younger who could weather the changes better handle it. But his general principle was people can only take so much change, and then they start to melt down.
So the only thing is, in terms of the racial disparities, Black people are worried about their sons being picked up on streets by police, and they have very real fears. And they've been denied a lot of the things that the rest of us sort of take for granted because we have white privilege. So their fears are really very basic, and many times they feel left out. I mean, in some
Oh, yeah.
ways, the Black experience and the very conservative white are almost analogous. Both are very afraid of things.
I think you're entirely right. But with the Black and brown people, it's even worse because it's a literal fear that your life could be taken away.
Yeah.
Not just your way of life, but your life.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's difficult is how to talk to people who are very different and see things in terms of black and white, and rather than life as shades of gray and feelings of shades of gray. And it just, the conversation kind of ends if that's where you are, there's nothing more to say. And that's difficult.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, that's certainly true. And unfortunately, that also roughly correlates with things like profession and educational levels. In some professions, you're taught to look at things from a variety of perspectives and to be sensitive to shades of gray and ambiguity and nuance. But in other professions, you're not. And or other jobs you're not, and that can spill over to the way you think about everything. Is there a big gray area, or is it everything black and white? And when people get scared, they tend to revert to black and white. This is good, that's bad.
Go ahead, Marilyn. You're on mute.
Yeah, I thought
There you go.
Charlie
Now you're
unmuted
good.
me when he raised the hand. One of the fears that I am really experiencing right now, and again, I'm a techie, over the years, electronic publishing has become the norm, and I utilize it. Audiobooks are great and such, but my brain keeps going back to the 30s and the 40s and the redaction of history. And I feel very strongly that we're reaching a point when all of your education is online and you can't pick a newspaper up, or very few newspapers anymore, that we're losing a printed history that is so easily edited that you don't even know it. So that's a techie's fear. The cancel culture plays into that. Those are things that really, really bother me. But life is grays, and it doesn't feel that way right now. When I was in Germany, when I was in college, I was kind of really taken, because I read a lot of World War II history, really taken by how going across a border had such an impact on the way of life. From Frankfurt, Germany, into the Alsace-Lorraine region, which was fought over multiple times, and into Paris, the difference in how people viewed themselves and what was important was really striking. And so, technically I've only lived 3 places, but that's what I see as real problems today. And I would be fascinated to see a list that was not branded of the fears of the people, do a class where everybody lists their fears without their names being attached to it, and see what we come up with.
Oh, that's a wonderful proposal. And you have introduced a new fear, and it goes back to, I think, the fear of rapid change and uncertainty. What is electronic communication, the internet, virtual learning? What is that going to do? I don't know. And I'm like you, I'm I have a lot of fears, and things are changing so quickly. I don't like it, and it does enable siloing. It does enable propaganda. It actually backfired and has, I think, discouraged communication across party lines. So we don't know where this is headed, don't know how to monitor it, don't know how to regulate it. And I'm with you. I love printed books.
We're drifting past 10 o'clock, and I'm told that we're under an ultimatum. I don't know if this will shut down automatically at some point, but we have Kathy and Heidi up yet. We'll try to get those two in, and then we probably should end up. Go ahead, Kathy, you're in there first.
Okay, thanks. Good morning. Just to pick up on what Eleanor was talking about too, when you're in a situation where you just have these circular arguments that occur over and over, you recognize the fears, you talk about the fears, but there's no solution to the fears. And it just fractures relationships and exacerbates the situation. It's a very bad experience when you don't know how to fix something. You know what the problem is, but there's no fixing it. So I just identified with what Eleanor was saying, having those kinds of conversations with people.
Yeah, even if you get at the level of talking about basic fears, conversations can still go nowhere and people can remain entrenched. And in fact, since I do this kind of, I try to promote cross-ideological conversation a lot. I'd say maybe only 1 out of 10 conversations did anything fruitful emerge. But 1 out of 10 is better than none out of 10. So I'm still guardedly, very guardedly, quasi-optimistic that some good might come out of trying to encourage conversations across polarized lines. Usually it doesn't. And I've got to admit that. Usually both parties are so entrenched, or just one of the parties is so entrenched that nothing good happens. That's a sad reality of the world in which we live. But every once in a while, there are those magic, almost miraculous moments when there is a spark of reconciliation.
Okay, final comment, Heidi.
Yeah, my comment just comes from a conversation I had with a relative about feeling guilty at work that they are a white gentleman at work, that the atmosphere where they work is they have support groups and organizations for everything but a white working male.
Yeah.
And it's like, when did we get to the point that we need to be understanding, but why do white working males have to feel guilty that they are white? It's just the climate, and I kind of understood what he was saying, because when I went to high school, I went to a high school in Philadelphia where it was primarily a Jewish high school. And I grew up with a name called Heidi Schuler. So that made even had teachers that would make comments when we learned about World War II, with them presuming with a name like that my family was from Germany, which they were not. They were from Romania and they were from a group called Saxons. So, which mainly were ethnically cleansed by the Russians. So, it's kind of funny how you're made to feel guilty for who you are sometimes by groups that you want to sympathize with or, work with.
Right, exactly. And that goes back to the theme that was pointed out, that there is a sense of being overlooked and forgotten and devalued on many positions on the social spectrum, that some of the folk on the radical right do say the problem is other ethnicities have been attended to and get special programs, and we've been forgotten. And it's usually white males. And there's truth in that. And on the other hand, there's the opposite problem that a lot of ethnicities are still being neglected, as the distribution of vaccines in the South is showing that African-American communities often don't get them, and aren't even told they're available, because many of the folk don't have internet connectivity. So there is that sense of being made to feel inferior, devalued, overlooked, maybe even guilty. And that's all over the place. I used to doubt that ageism was really a thing until I aged. and then I realized, oh yeah, this is real. When you're asked to remove yourself from a committee to make room for younger, more energetic people, yeah, that's ageism. So that sense of being threatened by other groups is pervasive.
Okay, with that, I think it's past 10 o'clock. So we'll end up now. Thank you, Lee. Very, very good conversations, very good comments from the folks. I appreciate that. So next week, same time, same station. Don't have to deal with another time change. We had good participation today and a good number of people tuning in. So thank you all, and thank you, Lee.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.